Kale ran through the narrow streets of the floating city, his heart pounding in his chest. The sky above shimmered with strange energy, casting shadows across the sleek, silver towers. He had come here to steal the dragon's ancient technology, a device that could turn the tide of the war on his home planet. But the mission had gone wrong. One moment he was sneaking past the guards, the next he was surrounded by massive dragons with scales that gleamed like molten metal. They circled him, wings spreading wide, claws scraping the air. Kale raised his sword, ready to fight, but he knew deep down that he was outmatched. A huge dragon, its scales a deep midnight blue, stepped forward, eyes glowing with intelligence and curiosity. Kale froze as the dragon sniffed the air, as if it could sense his intentions. He had faced many enemies, humans and aliens alike, but never a creature like this. Its presence was powerful, terrifying, yet there was something in its gaze that made him pause. Before he could react, a net of glowing energy shot from the dragon's mouth, wrapping him tightly. Kale struggled, but it was useless. The dragons moved in, lifting him into the air and carrying him to a massive structure in the center of the city. The building was unlike anything Kale had seen before. It was a tower of shimmering crystal, radiating light that pulsed like a heartbeat. He was pushed through a huge doorway and the dragons placed him inside a cell. The walls were made of thick, glowing metal, designed to hold even the largest dragons. The door closed behind him with a heavy clang. Kale looked around, trying to find a way out, but the cell was perfect in its security. There were no cracks, no weaknesses, no escape. He had expected danger, but this was beyond what he had imagined. Kale sank to the floor, his sword still in his hand. He could hear the dragons outside, their wings beating softly, their voices a mix of growls and low hums that he could not understand. At first he felt fear, pure and simple. He was trapped, alone and completely powerless. But then he noticed a small movement near the far side of the cell. A young dragon, smaller than the others, with golden eyes that glowed faintly, watched him carefully. Unlike the others, it did not growl or roar. It just stared, tilting its head slightly as if curious about him. Kale was cautious. He knew better than to trust a dragon, yet there was something in those golden eyes that made his chest tighten. He lowered his sword slightly and spoke in a soft voice, even though he doubted the dragon could understand him. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, hoping his words carried some meaning. The young dragon blinked slowly as if considering his words. It moved closer, its scales catching the light, and Kale realized that it was not aggressive. For the first time since he had arrived, he felt a flicker of hope. Days passed slowly. Kale had no food except what the dragons occasionally left outside the cell, small scraps he could barely eat. He spent hours observing the city from the small window of his cell, noticing the dragons' routines, their interactions, and their strange intelligence. The young golden-eyed dragon, whom he quietly named Lyra in his mind, came to the cell more often than the others. Sometimes it just watched, other times it made small sounds that Kale could not understand, but he tried to mimic them. He learned to move slowly when it approached so as not to frighten it. Kale began leaving tiny pieces of food near the edge of the cell whenever Lyra came close. At first she only touched them briefly, then stepped back. But day by day she lingered longer, moving closer to him, letting him sense her presence without fear. Kale started to talk to her, telling her stories of his home, of his people, of battles he had fought and survived. He did not know if she understood the words, but her golden eyes never left him, and she made small movements as if responding. The other dragons were always nearby, watching silently. They did not approach, but Kale felt their attention. It was as if they were judging him, waiting to see if he would harm Lyra or act with malice. Kale realized that the dragons were not simply beasts. They were intelligent and they had their own sense of justice. If he wanted to survive, he would need more than strength. He would need patience, understanding, and careful observation. One night, as the floating city glowed under the twin moons, Kale lay on the cold floor of the cell, staring at Lyra as she curled near the edge. He thought about the humans who had sent him here, the mission that had failed, and the life he might never return to. Yet, looking at the small dragon, he felt something shift inside him. It was not just survival anymore. It was curiosity, respect, and a strange kind of friendship. Kale knew that if he could connect with Lyra, maybe he could find a way not just to escape, but to change the dragon's view of humans. The days blended together, filled with quiet moments of observation and small gestures of trust. Kale's body remained tense, ready for danger, but his mind began to adapt to the strange rhythms of the dragon's world. He realized that brute force alone would not win him freedom. It was the bond with Lyra, fragile yet undeniable, that might become his greatest weapon. And for the first time since his capture, Kale allowed himself to hope that this bond could change everything, not just for him but for the humans and dragons alike. Outside, the dragons continued their patrols, wings flashing in the light, eyes sharp and watchful. Inside, Kale and Lyra shared silent moments of understanding, small signs of a connection that could not be broken by bars or claws. The warrior and the dragon, trapped together in a cell meant for monsters, were beginning to see something neither expected: the possibility of friendship, trust, and perhaps even a new future. Kale had grown used to the rhythm of the dragon's city. Each day he watched them soar through the sky, their wings cutting through the glowing clouds, their scales shimmering in the light. The other dragons still ignored him, keeping their distance, but Lyra, the golden-eyed dragon, came more often. She would hover near the edge of the cell, her eyes curious, tilting her head as if trying to understand him. At first, Kale had been careful, only offering small pieces of his rations. But over time he began to speak to her more, telling stories of the human worlds he had known, of forests, mountains, and the struggles of his people. Lyra responded in her own way. She moved closer when he spoke, sometimes touching the food he left with her claw. Sometimes she made soft, melodic sounds, almost like singing, and Kale tried to mimic them. He discovered that tone and patience mattered more than force or speed. The other dragons noticed these interactions, circling above the cell in quiet observation. Kale realized that they were intelligent and thoughtful, not just creatures of instinct. They judged actions carefully, and if he wanted to survive, he needed to act with honesty and respect. One morning, Kale found a small scroll of soft, glowing material at the edge of the cell. Lyra had pushed it close with her nose. He opened it and discovered simple symbols, like an early language, etched in the glowing material. They were diagrams, shapes that represented times, places, and actions. Kale could not read it completely, but he understood that it was an attempt at communication. He smiled quietly. Lyra was trying to teach him something. Over the next days, Kale practiced with the scroll. He traced symbols in the dust of the cell floor, drawing shapes that matched Lyra's. At first, she reacted with quick movements, almost impatient. But gradually she slowed, watching his attempts with interest. They developed a pattern of simple communication: gestures, sounds, and symbols that allowed them to share thoughts without speaking aloud. Kale realized that he had entered a strange, unspoken friendship. It was fragile, delicate, yet powerful. Kale began to notice small details about Lyra. Her scales glimmered in shades of gold and amber, shifting as the light hit them. Her eyes were wide and intelligent, full of emotion he had never expected from a creature so massive. She had scars along her wings, faint but visible, evidence of battles Kale imagined she had survived. The golden dragon was not just a companion. She was a warrior, a survivor, and someone who understood struggle. Kale felt a strange connection to her, a recognition of shared endurance despite their differences. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the floating city, Kale tried a new approach. He placed a hand against the glowing bars of the cell and spoke softly, "I am not your enemy, Lyra. I only want to understand you." Lyra lowered her head, bringing it closer to his hand. The warmth from her scales brushed against him, and Kale felt a shiver run down his spine. It was not fear or danger, it was trust. Slowly, he extended a piece of dried meat toward her. She took it gently as if understanding the gesture, then nuzzled his hand before stepping back. It was the first time Lyra had initiated contact, and Kale's chest tightened with something he could only describe as hope. Days turned into weeks. Kale and Lyra continued their silent lessons in communication. He learned how to read her movements, how a flick of her tail or a tilt of her head could convey meaning. In return, he taught her simple words, showing objects and repeating their names. Lyra began to recognize some of them, reacting when he said sky or food, moving in small circles to show understanding. The bond between them grew stronger with every shared moment, every patient exchange of gestures. Kale realized that fear was no longer the dominant force in their interaction. It was curiosity, trust, and mutual respect. One morning, Kale noticed a change in Lyra's behavior. She was restless, pacing along the edge of the cell, her eyes scanning the skies with tension. Kale followed her gaze and saw distant ships approaching the city, glinting in the sunlight. They were not dragons. The golden dragon's tail lashed nervously, her wings quivering. Kale knew immediately that danger was near. Without thinking, he placed his hands on the bars and shouted to the approaching figures, though he doubted they could hear him. Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, Kale sensed shared urgency. They were connected in understanding a threat beyond themselves. Lyra's instincts were precise. She moved closer to Kale, nudging him gently with her snout, then stepped back to watch the skies. Kale realized she wanted him to stay calm, to observe and learn. He took a deep breath, mimicking her focus, and together they watched the city prepare. Though he was still a prisoner, Kale felt that for the first time he had a partner, someone who saw him as more than a captive. Their connection had created an unspoken alliance, fragile but real. The other dragons began to notice. They circled lower, observing the interactions between Kale and Lyra. There was no hostility, only watchfulness. Kale understood that his actions now mattered not just for survival, but for earning trust from the entire dragon community. Every gesture, every word, every small act of patience was building a bridge between two very different species. Kale's heart swelled with cautious hope. He had entered the cell as a prisoner, expecting only fear and pain. Now he realized he had gained something far more valuable: understanding, friendship, and the possibility of changing the dragon's view of humans. By the end of the week, Kale could almost anticipate Lyra's actions. He knew when she would approach, when she would retreat, and even when she would nuzzle the food he left. Their bond had become a routine of trust and learning. Kale lay on the cold floor one night, looking up at the glowing cell walls and the floating city beyond. Lyra curled near the edge, golden eyes glimmering in the soft light. He whispered, "We'll survive this. Together." She responded with a low, melodic hum, almost like a promise. Kale realized something profound. Being locked in the dragon cell had seemed like the end of his journey, a punishment for his intrusion. Yet it had also become the start of a connection he never expected. He and Lyra had begun to break down walls not just of metal, but of fear, prejudice, and misunderstanding. In this strange, floating city, a human warrior and a golden-eyed dragon had discovered that trust and friendship could grow in the most unlikely places, and that bond might one day change the fate of both their species. Kale had spent weeks observing the dragons and learning their patterns. The golden-eyed dragon, Lyra, had become his constant companion, moving closer each day and responding to his gestures. Their bond had grown strong, yet Kale knew there was more to discover. The dragons were not just guarding the city, they were hiding something. He could feel it in the way they patrolled the skies, in the careful glances they cast toward the heart of the floating towers. The cell he was locked in was no ordinary prison. It held secrets, and Kale was determined to uncover them. One quiet night, when the city glowed softly under the twin moons, Kale traced his fingers along the glowing bars of the cell. He noticed a faint hum coming from the floor, almost like the pulse of the city itself. Curious, he pressed his hand against the metal, feeling the vibrations shift under his touch. Lyra watched him closely, tilting her head. Kale realized that the cell itself was alive in some way, linked to the dragon's energy. Perhaps it was meant not just to imprison but to communicate. He closed his eyes and focused, trying to sense what the vibrations meant. As he concentrated, he remembered the small scroll Lyra had pushed to him days before. The symbols, simple yet precise, had seemed like basic communication, but now Kale thought differently. What if the scroll was a key, a guide to understanding the cell and the dragon's intentions? He carefully copied the symbols in the dust on the floor, connecting them with lines and shapes. The patterns formed something like a map, showing paths, mechanisms, and nodes that pulsed with the same energy he felt beneath his hand. His heart raced. There was more to this prison than he had imagined. Lyra moved closer, her golden eyes shining in the dim light. She nudged Kale's hand toward the floor, pressing gently as if encouraging him to continue. He realized she was guiding him, helping him understand the dragon's technology. The cell was not just a barrier, it was a tool for teaching and observing. Kale smiled faintly. The dragons were not cruel, they wanted to see if he could understand, if he could adapt. And now, with Lyra's help, he was beginning to do exactly that. Over the next few days, Kale experimented with the vibrations in the cell. By pressing specific points, he discovered that some panels responded with subtle shifts, opening small compartments that contained ancient writing and glowing symbols. The scripts were like nothing he had seen before, but he could feel their meaning. They spoke of protection, of guardianship, and of a looming threat that had once nearly destroyed the dragon's city. Kale realized that the dragons had been preparing for centuries, hiding knowledge and technology to defend themselves from a danger far beyond what humans could imagine. Lyra seemed to understand Kale's discoveries. She made small movements, tapping on specific parts of the cell and letting him see how the mechanisms worked. Together they unlocked small portions of the hidden archives. Kale read what he could, translating the symbols into ideas he understood. The dragons were not hoarding knowledge for power, they were protecting their people, ensuring survival in a galaxy that was often cruel and unpredictable. Kale's respect for them grew. They were not enemies, they were guardians. One day as Kale explored the cell, he noticed a hidden channel near the base of the wall. It was narrow, but it pulsed with energy that matched the dragon's heartbeat-like vibrations. Lyra tapped at it with her claw, then looked at Kale expectantly. He understood immediately. The channel was a communication link, a way for him to speak to the dragons in their own language. With careful gestures and simple sounds, he pressed the energy nodes, sending pulses that Lyra seemed to recognize. She responded with gentle hums and tail flicks, and Kale realized that he could now converse with her in a way far deeper than before. Through this connection, Kale learned more about the dragon's fears and hopes. They had seen empires rise and fall, species come and go. The technology he had been sent to steal was not a weapon. It was a key to survival, something the dragons had created to protect their kind from threats that even humans could not comprehend. Kale understood why they had locked him away, not to punish but to judge, to see if he was worthy of trust. And now, through patience, observation and his bond with Lyra, he was proving that humans could be allies, not enemies. As days passed, Kale and Lyra continued to explore the secrets of the cell. They discovered hidden chambers, energy conduits, and archives filled with knowledge that had been kept for centuries. Kale realized that the dragon's city was a living library, a fortress, and a home all at once. Lyra guided him, showing him patterns in the energy and movements in the walls. Kale learned to sense danger, to understand the city's rhythms, and to anticipate events before they happened. The cell, once a place of confinement, had become a classroom, a laboratory, and a bridge between two species. One evening, Kale noticed a faint glow coming from a panel near the top of the cell. It pulsed differently from the rest, almost like a heartbeat with a faster rhythm. Lyra nudged him toward it, then stepped back, watching intently. Kale pressed his hand against the panel, feeling the energy flow into him. Visions of distant stars, of battles long past, and of dragons flying through endless skies filled his mind. He realized that the cell was connected not just to the city, but to the very history of the dragon's people. It held memories, knowledge, and warnings, everything a guardian needed to protect the city and its inhabitants. Kale looked at Lyra and smiled. They had unlocked part of the dragon's secret together. Their bond had allowed him to see what no human had ever seen. He understood that this knowledge carried responsibility. He was no longer just a prisoner or a warrior sent to steal. He was part of something larger, something that could change the future of both humans and dragons. And with Lyra by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges were coming. Outside the cell, the dragons continued their patrols, unaware that a human warrior had begun to understand their secrets. Inside, Kale and Lyra sat close, sharing silent gestures of recognition and trust. The cell that had once been a prison was now a place of discovery, a place where fear had transformed into curiosity and understanding. Kale realized that survival was no longer his only goal. The bond he had formed with Lyra, and the secrets they had uncovered together, might one day save the dragons, and perhaps even his own people, from dangers they could not yet imagine. Kale had grown stronger in mind and spirit, though his body remained confined within the glowing metal walls of the dragon cell. His bond with Lyra had deepened, and together they had uncovered much of the dragon's hidden knowledge. But Kale knew that trust was fragile. The other dragons were still watching, silent and unyielding. He had learned patience and understanding, but now he would be tested in ways he could not have imagined. One morning, the great midnight blue dragon that had first captured him appeared at the edge of the cell. Its eyes were sharp, scanning Kale with a mixture of suspicion and command. Lyra moved closer to Kale, pressing her head gently against his shoulder as if to calm him. The dragon spoke in low, resonant tones, a language Kale did not fully understand. He could sense the meaning behind it, a warning, a challenge, a question of loyalty. The warrior knew immediately that the dragons wanted proof that his intentions were true. Kale took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm as he replied with gestures and sounds he had practiced with Lyra. He mimicked the rhythms of their calls, hoping to convey honesty. Lyra added her own signals, nudging his hand and moving her tail in patterns that matched his attempts. Slowly, the great dragon's expression softened, though its gaze remained wary. Kale realized that this was more than a simple test. It was a trial of courage, intelligence, and integrity. One mistake could destroy the fragile trust he had built. The following days were tense. The dragons restricted Kale's access to the small scrolls and energy nodes he had been using to communicate with Lyra. He could only rely on his memory, his patience, and the silent cues from the golden-eyed dragon. Each movement mattered. Each gesture was under scrutiny. Kale had to prove that he could act without deceit, that he could work with the dragons instead of against them. It was a test of character, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. Lyra remained steadfast. She positioned herself near Kale whenever the larger dragons were present, her eyes meeting his in reassurance. Kale noticed that the golden dragon's presence seemed to influence the others, calming their suspicion just enough to give him room to act. It was as if Lyra was vouching for him. Kale understood then that trust was not just a feeling, it was a choice, one that required effort, courage, and respect. One day, a group of dragons approached the cell with urgency. They carried glowing devices and moved with precision, signaling danger Kale could not yet see. Lyra nudged him forward, pressing against the bars, and Kale realized that this was the moment to act. Using the gestures he had learned and the symbols memorized from the scrolls, he activated a series of energy nodes within the cell. Light pulsed in the metal walls, creating patterns that mirrored the dragon's own energy flows. The other dragons watched intently. Kale's pulse raced, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. As the energy reached its peak, a hidden compartment opened in the floor, revealing more glowing symbols and mechanisms. Kale pointed to the diagrams, then to Lyra, demonstrating that he understood their purpose. The dragons leaned closer, their wings brushing the walls, eyes studying his movements. Kale's hands shook slightly, but he kept steady, following the instructions he had learned. Lyra tapped the nodes with her claws, adding precision to his actions. Slowly, the dragon's expressions shifted. Suspicion gave way to cautious recognition. Kale had passed the first part of the trial. But the real test came when the dragons demanded more than understanding. They demanded action. A small creature, a scout from another galaxy, had infiltrated the city. The dragons expected Kale to respond without harming their kin or destabilizing the energy fields. Kale's mind raced. He had to act quickly, using both human ingenuity and what he had learned from Lyra. He traced new patterns in the energy conduits, mimicking the rhythms he had observed. Lyra moved in sync with him, her golden eyes focused and alert. Together, they redirected the energy to gently repel the intruder without causing harm. The dragons watched in silence. When the intruder was pushed safely away, the great midnight blue dragon lowered its head. Its eyes, once sharp and suspicious, now held a measure of respect. Kale exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. He had proven that his intentions were true, that he could act with caution, intelligence, and care. Lyra chirped softly, nuzzling his hand, and Kale smiled. The bond between them had been tested, and it had endured. The trial did not end there. Over the next days, Kale faced smaller tests, understanding complex energy patterns, identifying hidden threats, and demonstrating patience with the younger dragons who were still wary of him. Each time, he relied on observation, memory, and his silent connection with Lyra. Slowly, the other dragons began to accept him, their eyes less sharp, their wings less tense. Kale realized that trust was not immediate. It was built through consistent action and mutual respect. By the end of the week, Kale was no longer just a prisoner in the cell. He had become a participant in the dragon's world, a human warrior who could think like them, anticipate their needs, and act with care. Lyra remained his guide and partner, her golden eyes shining with pride. The great midnight blue dragon and others nodded subtly whenever Kale successfully completed a task, acknowledging his efforts without words. The cell that had once been a place of fear was now a space of learning, testing, and trust. Kale reflected on how far he had come. When he was first captured, he had expected pain, hostility, and perhaps death. Instead, he had found an opportunity, a chance to connect, to learn, and to prove that humans were capable of understanding and respect. The dragons had tested him, and he had risen to meet the challenge. More than survival, he had gained something far more valuable: trust, respect, and the beginnings of an alliance that could reshape the future. As he lay on the cold floor of the cell that night, Lyra curled beside him, a quiet warmth against his side. Kale whispered, "We've passed the trial, Lyra. Now we can face whatever comes next." She responded with a low, melodic hum, almost like a promise. Outside, the dragons continued their patrols, their wings cutting through the glowing skies, but inside, Kale and Lyra shared a silent understanding. The bond forged in a prison of metal had been tested and had endured, proving that trust, once earned, could overcome fear, suspicion, and even the deepest divides between species. Kale realized that this trust would not only keep him alive but also prepare him for the challenges ahead. Together with Lyra, he would face the coming dangers with courage, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty. The dragons had demanded proof, and Kale had delivered. And in return, he had gained something no weapon could provide: the chance to be more than a warrior. He could now be an ally, a bridge between humans and dragons and perhaps the hope for a future where both could survive and thrive. Kale woke to the soft glow of the floating city, the twin moons casting silver light across the towers. The dragons were already in motion, wings cutting through the morning haze, their patrols precise and synchronized. Kale stretched on the cold floor of the cell, feeling a strange sense of anticipation rather than fear. Lyra stirred beside him, golden eyes bright and alert. Today was different. The dragons had accepted him. His bond with Lyra had grown stronger, and the time had come to move beyond trust tests. There was a new challenge ahead, a threat approaching the city from the stars. From the top of his cell, Kale saw distant shapes moving against the sky. Ships, dark and sleek, coming toward the floating city. The dragon's energy flared in response, wings beating faster, eyes narrowing. Kale understood immediately that this was the threat Lyra had sensed days ago. He rose and stood at the bars, speaking softly to Lyra. "We can help. Together we can protect them." She nudged his shoulder, pressing her head against him, a silent agreement passing between them. Kale felt a rush of purpose. No longer a prisoner, he was now a participant in the city's defense. The dragons allowed him access to the cell's energy nodes, trusting him to act with care. Kale moved quickly, following the patterns he had learned with Lyra's guidance. They worked in perfect rhythm. He activated conduits, she adjusted energy flows with delicate touches of her claws. Together they created a network of defense that pulsed with the dragon's power, a shield that could repel or redirect attackers without harming the city itself. Kale marveled at the speed and precision of their cooperation. It was unlike anything he had experienced on human battlefields. As the enemy ships drew closer, Kale could see them more clearly. They were not dragons nor human. Their forms were strange and mechanical, armed with weapons designed to pierce armor and energy shields. The dragons moved as one, but Kale realized that their instincts alone might not be enough to counter the new tactics. He suggested adjustments to the energy flows, showing the dragons subtle patterns he had observed in the enemy's movement. Lyra responded instantly, transmitting his ideas with precise gestures and melodic sounds. The other dragons watched, hesitant at first, then began to incorporate his guidance. The battle began in earnest. The intruding ships fired beams of energy, cutting through the clouds and sending flashes across the city. Kale directed the flows, Lyra mirrored his movements and the dragons followed. Energy pulsed from the towers, forming barriers that absorbed attacks and redirected them into harmless dispersions. Kale felt the thrill of action not as a prisoner but as an ally. He shouted instructions, using the symbols and gestures the dragons had taught him. Lyra answered with her hums and signals, and together they orchestrated a defense that was both precise and beautiful. Despite the chaos, Kale remained calm. He trusted Lyra, and he trusted the dragons who had once kept him locked away. Each pulse of energy, each coordinated maneuver, strengthened the alliance between human and dragon. The enemy faltered, unable to predict the combined strategy. Kale realized that trust and cooperation were more powerful than brute strength. What humans often achieved with weapons alone, the dragons achieved with intelligence and instinct. Together they created something neither species could do on its own. The battle reached its peak when one of the enemy ships broke through the outer shields, heading straight for the city's central tower. Kale and Lyra acted instantly. He traced a sequence of energy nodes, redirecting power with precise timing. Lyra flapped her wings, generating a counterwave that deflected the ship's energy beam. The other dragons joined, forming a shield of wings, claws, and energy. The intruder stumbled, then fell back, forced to retreat. The city remained unharmed, thanks to their combined efforts. After the last of the enemy ships disappeared into the distance, the dragons settled over the city, their wings folding gracefully as they landed. Kale lowered himself to the floor, exhausted but exhilarated. Lyra curled around his side, golden eyes bright with pride. The great midnight blue dragon approached, lowering its head near Kale's shoulder. Its gaze was no longer suspicious or questioning. It carried recognition, respect, and acceptance. Kale bowed slightly, understanding the gesture. The dragons were acknowledging him not as a prisoner, but as a partner, an ally, and a friend. The city buzzed with energy, but there was a calm that settled over the dragons and Kale. The danger had passed, and a new understanding had been forged. Kale realized that the bond he shared with Lyra had created something far greater than survival. It had created an alliance. Humans and dragons could work together, combining intelligence, strength, and courage to protect one another. For the first time, Kale felt that the future could be different, brighter, and full of possibility. In the following days, Kale helped the dragons fortify the city further. He studied their techniques, shared his own strategies, and worked alongside Lyra and the other dragons. Slowly, humans began arriving in small fleets, tentative but willing to learn. Kale acted as a bridge between the species, teaching humans how to respect the dragons' abilities, while helping dragons understand human ingenuity. The floating city became a place of cooperation, where knowledge, skill, and courage were shared freely. One evening, Kale stood atop the central tower with Lyra beside him. The city shimmered beneath the twin moons, lights reflecting off the floating towers. Kale looked at the dragons soaring above, then at Lyra, golden eyes glimmering with trust. "We've done it," he whispered. "We've built something new." Lyra hummed softly in reply, curling closer to him. Kale knew that this alliance was only the beginning. Together, humans and dragons could face any threat, overcome any challenge, and explore the stars in ways neither species could have imagined alone. Kale's journey from prisoner to ally had been long and difficult, but it had changed him. He understood that trust was fragile, that courage alone was not enough, and that bonds could form in the most unlikely places. Lyra had taught him patience, intelligence, and the power of silent communication. The dragons had taught him respect, strategy, and the strength found in unity. Together, they had created a new future, one where humans and dragons were not enemies but partners. As the night deepened, Kale and Lyra sat quietly on the tower watching the stars. The city below pulsed with life, a living testament to the trust, courage, and cooperation that had grown from a dragon's cell. Kale smiled, thinking back to the day he had first been captured. He had entered as a warrior ready to fight and survive. Now he was something more, a friend, an ally, and a bridge between worlds. The bond he had formed with Lyra and the dragons would endure, shaping the destiny of both species for generations to come.